Hey everybody, we're back to go ahead and install this Corsair H100i. We're going to go ahead and put it into our computer build here. So we've already installed our RAM as well as our CPU into this motherboard. You can see that we have our back plate for the H100i. You can see that these little legs move back and forth. Basically, the two different Intel connectors. This will fit the 1366 and the 1150. For this particular CPU, we'll be pushing them in for the smaller fit of the 1150. Now you can see there's kind of a cross pattern already built into the motherboard on this. So you have the full bolts on the back side. This will sit on the back plate behind the CPU on the opposite side of the motherboard. And then we'll use these standoff screws to go ahead and tie it down. So we're going to go ahead and flip the motherboard over here real fast. You can see that we have our 4 screw holes. We're going to go ahead and insert this onto the back plate. Just make sure it fits in there nice and snug. Go flip it over, make sure that they keep staying through the holes. Now our back came off with 2 sets of standoff screws. For this particular one, you want to make sure you use the one that is marked in the instructions. One will be smaller and one will be longer. We're going to go ahead and insert this standoff screw into the back plate that we just put into the motherboard. Go ahead and screw it down nice and snug. Now you'll notice when you put this on that it won't be extremely tight. It'll be a little bit loose, so it'll feel like it wobbles, and it won't feel like it should. You'll think that for some reason it's not fitting. Don't worry about it. That's completely fine. It's a little bit used to help secure the thermal paste on top of the processor to give that little bit of play. So we have 2 of our 4 screws in. We're going to go ahead and put the remaining 2 in. Just using my hand to brace the back of the back plate to make sure it stays through on the back side of the motherboard. We have our last one to put in here. Alright, that's the first step of installing this water cooler onto the motherboard. It is much easier to do if you don't have a lot of things connected to your motherboard. So I'd suggest taking it out and making it a little bit easier. You can see there's our 4 screws that we've put in. Now the next step, what we're going to skip to, is actually go ahead and put the fans onto the radiator. So here we have our 2 fans and our radiator itself. Now if you're looking to put in 4 fans, you would need to buy or purchase the additional 2 fans. Now looking at the fans, you want to make sure that you're putting them on the correct direction. We want to make sure that the air is flowing through the fan. We're going to put this in a pull, so it'll pull air through the radiator, which is what actually Corsair suggests, and that makes sense, pulling outside cool air through the radiator rather than pushing hot internal air of your computer through it. So this will go through the fan and then into the screw holes in the radiator. You also want to make sure that you put them on with the cable facing the direction that you want it to go towards. Now I'm going to make sure they face the hoses on my radiator. I'm going to put this inside fan in first, as it will be a little bit more of a struggle to put in the secondary. So we're going to go ahead and make sure we thread this screw through in the correct hole. You want to make sure that it's not going into the radiator fins, or that'll damage your product. You want to make sure that these are pretty snug. You want to avoid any vibration that might come from the fan working. So just go ahead and put them in pretty snug. I like to put all 4 in before I really start to tighten them down. That way I can make sure that they're lined up correctly in all the right holes. It'll also be a little bit stiff to get in the first couple of threads in. They're not technically pre-threaded, I don't believe. Basically, it's just a drilled hole, so you're almost threading it a little bit once you're putting the screw in. So you'll notice it'll be a little bit tight, and that's okay. Our last screw down here at the bottom, which will be the trickiest one, it's behind all these cables. Alright, so we have our first fan installed. We'll go ahead and put our second fan on. Cable facing the same direction. Just kind of put it down in between the two fans. Go ahead and install this in. Two more screws to go. And here's our last screw to finish putting the fans on. Alright, and there we have it. We have our two fans put on. If you're looking to do additional two, they'd go on the opposite side. It does come with the screws for that as well. So here's our power cables. We'll need to connect to the motherboard. Now the fan power is actually going to connect to the CPU block. So we have our little Y splitter here. It comes with these little black sheaths on top of the pin connectors. One end, which is proprietary, will fit into the CPU block down here. And the other two ends will fit onto the power for the fans themselves. Let's go ahead and remove those. Go ahead and insert the power cable on. You'll notice there's a little pathway for them to fit onto. You'll see that there's a groove on one side, and it's basically a standout on the other. It'll fit in just like so. Now we're not going to connect it just yet to make it a little bit easier to thread in. So they'll go in just like this. So we can put the other two fans on right here if we wanted to and pull or push air through to give it an extra airflow through the radiator. So it'll give it a little bit extra cooling. It's definitely an option that you do have, and it does have the slots for that on the water block and the additional Y connector for that. We're going to go ahead and attach this to the portion of the case that we'll be using. So you could imagine this as being the top portion of your computer case. This will be a side portion of my HAF Stacker that I have. It's a pretty simple process. What you're going to do is basically put the radiator against these screw holes here, and then go ahead and screw it in just like you did the fans. So we have our additional screws, a little bit shorter than the fan screws, of course. So you see it's got the mesh here. We have the screw holes. You want to make sure you line it up where it'll fit best within your machine itself. I'm going to put mine towards the back, as that's where the connection that I'll be feeding through the cables through will be. We'll be putting in a total of 8 screws. We're going to do the same thing, so I'm going to put them in nice and snug. I don't want any vibration here. But I won't tighten extreme amounts until I get all of them in and into place and make sure it's going to fit perfectly for us. Loosen up just a little bit to make sure I can get them all lined up. Go ahead and put our second screw in. A little bit loose, which is what I want it to be. Now, I really don't like to fast forward my videos. If you've watched any of my other videos, I'm going to show you exactly kind of the length of time this is going to take to go from start to finish, if you're looking to do this for your first time as well. Feel free to skip ahead about a minute if you want to watch the actual install onto the CPU, which will be the next step for us. So I'm not skipping any screws on this. I want to make sure it's held in nice and tight. So putting in all 8 screws. That'll also help with vibration as well. After a while the fans will vibrate a little bit and it'll make the screws a little bit loose, and we don't want any sound coming out of this, or actually being the least amount of sound as possible. Go ahead and go through and snug them all up nice and tight. Now, I like to attach it to the case first before I connect it to the CPU. It seems like it's a little bit easier to put on. You don't have this pulling down on the water block as you're trying to attach it. It's easier just to connect it to the case before you actually connect the water block. Now, if you wanted to put in or have an additional radiator or an additional fan here, that's something that you'd always have the option for as well. Now, the next step is I'm going to go ahead and put this into the case, and then we'll go ahead and put the water block onto the CPU. So here we have it installed in my HAF Stacker case. Basically what I need to do is I need to feed this through the stacker down towards the CPU itself. I have my little grommet here. It's removable. I find it easier to remove it first and then feed it through and then put the grommet in the end, rather than trying to deal with this. Now, you want to be careful as you're feeding this around. I left the plastic cover on top of the water block so the thermal paste doesn't get messed up. I'm just going to use the stock thermal paste for now. I will be doing a full water cooling on this eventually as well, and then I'll go ahead and put the new thermal paste on that when it happens. So just moving my grommet around a little bit, make sure it's is in its correct spot. All the cables are going to be fed through that as well. We're going to feed this through. Now, in this particular case, I'm going to have to put this water block on with the logo upside down. It won't affect the performance at all. Just so you're aware, that's why I am putting on upside down. It doesn't necessarily matter if it's upside down, sideways. You can put on any direction that you would like, as it is a square. But I would put it on logo facing the correct direction if I had that opportunity. Just making sure all my cables come through. Trying to just put the grommet in place. Just make sure it's not getting bunched up or any cables are getting caught. All right. Now, one thing that I'm going to avoid is putting any cables onto this before I actually attach it to the CPU. I don't want anything getting in the way of attaching this. So the next piece that I'm going to need is an actual square connection and these thumb screws. These will thread on top of the standoffs that we put in to the back of the motherboard already. Now I would suggest installing your motherboard before doing this. It makes it much easier. So I'm just going to maneuver the water block and make sure it's going to be in the correct position for me. We're going to take this top portion of the block and put it onto the water block itself. Go ahead and put our cables out of the way. We're going to go ahead and test fit it with the plastic connection still on the bottom of it, so I'm not messing with my thermal paste. Looks like it's going to fit perfect. I'm going to go ahead and remove this portion. Now when we're doing this, we want to make sure that it sits nice and flat on top of the CPU. I don't want to mess with my thermal paste. I don't want to get any ridges on it. Normally it will flatten out, but it's easier just to go ahead and put it down right the first time. So we're just going to make it nice and flat before I start putting it down onto the screw connectors here. Once I get it in place, I'm going to go ahead and hold it down flat onto the CPU. I'll put my first thumb screw on. So keeping continuous pressure onto the water block. Hold it down as I get my second thumb screw here. That way it doesn't lift off. I'm not ruining my thermal paste that's on. It's nice and continuous push onto the CPU. That's our second thumb screw. We'll go ahead and put our third thumb screw on here. Now normally once you get 3 on, it's going to be nice and snug on there, so you can go ahead and remove your finger. The fourth one is usually pretty tricky anyways if it's behind the cables here, depending upon your build. It may be easier to go ahead and use a screwdriver to go ahead and attach it. Now I like mine to be very snug, so I'm going to use a screwdriver to make sure that I get them nice and snug. I'm going to screw them down all to the same kind of snug and firmness. We want them to be nice and even and level. Just making sure that they're finger tightened, nice and snug. We'll try to give them a little bit extra turn with the screwdriver just to make sure. Now I'm not talking about tightening this down as tight as you possibly can get it. We want it firm. We want it nice and snug. We don't want to break the motherboard itself or damage the water cooler. Now the only reason why I'm using the screwdriver on the back one is because it's really hard to get finger tightened. I'm just going to make sure that I feel like it's about the same snug and firmness as the others. Go ahead and pull off our little plastic covering here. Now that we got it nice and attached to the motherboard. So now that we have everything put in, we can go ahead and start to connect our cables. This is our fan connection. So this goes on either depending upon how you install it, it'll go onto the top or the bottom portion of the CPU. It'll go towards the cells of the Corsair ship here. Go ahead and insert it into the slot. It can be a little bit tricky. You can see that's a little bit of a different connector. It's pretty thin, much like you'd see for like a SATA connector. And kind of pull the slack through so the internal portion of the CPU or the chassis looks nice and clean. The power cable, we'll need to connect our SATA power and this to the motherboard. You can see right here is our CPU fan. You can see we have CPU fan and CPU opt. The OPT is the optional fan. So we need to put this onto the first fan connection here on the motherboard, the top portion. Now this is a 4-pin fan connector, but it's just fine to put a 3-pin on it, which is what this is. We're going to be very careful to make sure we put this on without bending the pins of the fan. This connection here is for the SATA power. We'll connect that at a later time once we put our power supply in. Just zooming out, you can see how everything's connected. We also have our Corsair link cable. So if you would like to monitor or have control over the CPU cooler, you can use this to change the LED color. I believe the base color is a white. You can actually change it to full control over the red, green, and blue properties. So you can really change it to almost whatever color you would like. We insert it into the side, and then the other cable is going to go down here at the bottom. Now normally I'd run this through the back and give it a nice clean cable look. I'm not going to bother that at this point, just because this is a tutorial of how to connect it. Make sure that if I were you, I would make sure it's nice clean run cables. We don't want it in front of our video cards that'll be going in this. And we'll connect it to one of the USB ports. This particular motherboard has a couple different slots for USB 2.0, so we'll go ahead and put it onto that connection. You'll need to read your instruction manual of where this is located on your board if you'd like to use the Corsair link cable. It does run without it. You don't have to have it connected either, but it just gives you additional functionality. And insert it like so. And that's it. That is our Corsair H100i installed into this build. And remember, don't forget to connect your SATA power cable from your power supply. See, it looks nice. Got our fans in here. If you like the video, hit the like button. As always, keep watching, and I'll throw some more videos down in the description.